to reasonable adjustments. And obviously in part one, we talked about what a reasonable adjustment is, what sort of laws that it's joined up with, but also, you know, the fact that we're now going to talk about the definition of disability, because that is such a pertinent subject matter of which reasonable adjustments surround that definition. So please tell us what the definition of disability is.
Yes. So I think the one of the issues for schools is that very often they don't necessarily have an understanding of the breadth of the definition. So I thought it'd be worth sharing some of the detail on that. If you like, it might sound as if it gets a bit technical, but it's relatively simple. But again, Tina, if I just mention that this is set down fairly clearly in the CDC guides, which I know you're going to add a slide with the, you know, a link to the CDC guides. So again, you know, if you have questions about the definition, if you have or you're uncertain about it, do look at the guides, because that gives a much fuller account. And we're kind of just talking through the issues on the podcast. So to get a more sort of a sharper, clearer and a fuller account of all of the issues we're going to cover in part two, do please go to the CDC guides. But the definition itself in the Equality Act says that someone has a disability if they have a physical or mental impairment that has a long-term and substantial adverse effect on their ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities. Okay, so that needs quite a lot of unpacking there. But the bit that I want to focus on is that long-term and substantial adverse effect on someone's ability to carry out normal day-to-day activities. So in the Equality Act, long-term is defined as being a year or more, which actually obviously sort of rules out things like a broken leg, but it also includes recurring impairments. So for example, someone who has depression, for them one period of depression might last for less than a year, but because it's a recurring condition, it's included in the definition, even though individual episodes don't last for less than a year. But the more tricky, or the more important bit almost of the definition, is that substantial adverse effect on someone's ability to carry out day-to-day activities. So substantial is defined in the Equality Act as being more than minor or trivial. That provides quite a low threshold for someone to count as having a disability. Minor or trivial, it's got to be, if you like, big enough to have substance, rather than, substantial. We tend to think of, I tend to think of, a substantial meal is a big one. Actually, substantial in this context is defined as more than minor or trivial. So it's enough to have an impact, an adverse effect that you could measure, if you like. It has substance, and it is, if you like, measurable, or it's big enough to be measured, if you like. So this is a much broader group than most people think of just in their daily life. Everyone probably recognizes someone who's deaf or blind, or someone has a physical impairment may count as being disabled, but by and large we don't tend to think so broadly. So I looked back at the latest figures from the Family Resources Survey, which is carried out by the Office for National Statistics, and sticking quite closely to the definition of disability, the survey in 2023 to 2024 estimated that 12% of children count as disabled under the Equality Act definition. And that's more than most people might think of. I mean, roughly speaking, in a class of 30, it's going to be, on average, just over 3 pupils per class of 30. Again, that's probably more than most people think of. And just to give you some idea of how that compares with the percentages of children with special educational needs, it's in 2025, 5.3% of children had an EHCP, and 14.2% of children were identified on SEN support. So that's a total of 19.5, or very nearly 20% of children identified with SEN. But that's not to say that the two groups completely overlap. There may be many children who count as disabled, perhaps because they have a medical condition, such as diabetes or epilepsy, which might mean they're not necessarily included in the SEN figures. So it's important to recognise that whilst obviously there's a significant overlap between children identified as having SEN and those who are likely to count as being disabled, they are not necessarily precisely overlapping. There may be children who have one but not the don't count as being, may have SEN but don't count as disabled, or maybe disabled don't count as having SEN. So it's not a straightforward overlap. And I think the difficulty for many schools is not understanding the breadth of the definition, or how the definition includes children whose behaviour arises from the nature of their disability. But whatever, the reasonable adjustments duty is really central to making sure that we don't discriminate. And there's a range of ways in which the Equality Act sets out in which we may discriminate against disabled pupils. But reasonable adjustments is the main way in which schools can ensure that they are not discriminating. So, Tina, what about looking a little bit more at the reasonable adjustments duty itself and thinking about how it applies to schools?
I think so. I mean, as you said, we did gather some feedback before we do the podcast. It's not feedback, but they can have an opportunity to ask questions. And I think, what is the requirements and what does make a reasonable adjustment, I think is a really good question that actually, that there is conversation, certainly from the questions that have been asked around, the cost of these reasonable adjustments. So I think if you go through, what the requirements that make reasonable adjustments, and then, we can ask the question, what is reasonable?
Yes.
I think that would answer the questions that we got through from potential listeners to the pod.
Yeah. Okay. So we're required, and as schools, yes, but of course the duties do apply to other educational institutions, and more broadly to public and commercial institutions. It's a very, very broad coverage in the Equality Act. But I'll focus on schools, but I will highlight a couple of differences for early years and FE in relation to reasonable adjustments. But we're required to make reasonable adjustments to ensure that disabled pupils are not placed at a substantial disadvantage in comparison with their non-disabled peers. And just a little, I'm hoping a little ping goes off in people's grey cells at that point when I use the word substantial, because that word recurs in different places throughout the Equality Act, and it has that same definition as we discussed in relation to the definition of disability itself. So substantial is more than minor or trivial. So placing a disabled pupil at a substantial disadvantage compared with their peers is relatively easy to do that. And we are required to make those reasonable adjustments in order that we do not place that disabled pupil at a substantial disadvantage. Now, that we touched on this in the first podcast. It means that we have to think ahead, because if we fail to make an adjustment and we do place that disabled pupil at a substantial disadvantage, we have discriminated. So we have to think ahead and prevent that substantial disadvantage. And that's one of the key things about the reasonable adjustments duty. So it does require thought, it probably requires some discussion, and we talked about the benefits of discussing it with disabled children, young people themselves, so that we're confident we're doing something that's going to work, if you like. But there is a range of ways in which this duty applies to the life of different educational institutions. There are three areas that are covered by the reasonable adjustments duty. And the main one, which applies to all educational schools, early years settings, to colleges, is adjustments to any provision, criterion, or practice. So that's really about the ways in which schools organize themselves, as written policies, it's daily practices, whether they're codified in a policy or not, it doesn't matter. Any of the ways in which they apply particular considerations, could apply to timetabling, it applies really across all the ways in which schools organize themselves. Now, the second requirement, because this is simply the way they're listed in the Equality Act, applies to alterations to physical features. Now, that particular element of the reasonable adjustments duty doesn't apply to schools. It does apply to early years settings and to FE colleges. Doesn't apply to schools. There is a separate requirement on schools, which I'd quite like to talk about in a bit more detail later, is the requirement to have an accessibility plan. And schools are not covered by the duty to make reasonable adjustments to physical features. They have, if you like, instead, they have this longer term strategic duty around increasing accessibility. And I'll say a bit more about that later. But that second requirement around alterations to physical features, reasonable adjustments duty, applies to early years and FE colleges, but not to schools. Then the third element in the reasonable adjustments duties is about reasonable adjustments to the provision of auxiliary aids and services. Now, that might be a reasonable adjustment providing a little bit of equipment. It might be about consulting a specialist service for some advice about how to adjust the environment for a disabled pupil. It might be a range of things, but there are, in this context, there are some considerations about what counts as reasonable that are relevant, because I can hear everyone thinking, well, surely the provision of an auxiliary aid is that surely we make that through the SEN framework, don't we? The Children and Families Act requires that special educational provision. Isn't that where aids come in? Yes, quite right. And that is one of the considerations that can be taken into account when we're thinking about what is reasonable and what isn't reasonable. So, I mean, I'll pause there, Tina, because I just want to be confident that we've covered those three different requirements and need to be really clear that that physical alterations reasonable adjustment doesn't apply to schools, but does to early years and FE. It's the other two for schools, the adjustments to any provision, criterion, or practice, and the auxiliary aids and services adjustments that apply to schools. Then, let's see if you think that's sort of roughly clear or
No,
not.
I think
We're
no, I
going to
think
think about
I
what's
think it's
reasonable.
no, I think it's clear because this is a starting conversation. And as you've said, we've got the guides. We're going to put that on our YouTube channel. We'll put the links to the website as well within the podcast blurb. And I think, what's next, I think, is about what is reasonable.
Yeah.
And, some of the comments that we've had in our chats, well, not our chats, but the sort of, the ask from our potential audience, is around, what is reasonable, but also, looking at expectations from parents and families, around TA time or whatever the parents are expecting as a reasonable adjustment. And I understand parents being the advocate for the child that they are, because they are. Sometimes what we would describe as reasonable might not be reasonable to other people. So I think it's really important that we look at what's reasonable, and also touching on, we touched on episode 1 about where parents can go to have a conversation if they are worried that what's being provided is not reasonable and there's discrimination. So we can touch on that again. I know we sort of mentioned it in episode 1, the first episode of this particular subject. But what is reasonable, Philippa?
Yeah. Well, no one actually defines that. And, to be fair, it's going to be so particular to the individual circumstances, isn't it? That it would be very difficult to define it really sharply. But the help that we have from the Equalities and Human Rights Commission, the EHRC, is a kind of list, if you like, of considerations that may be taken into account in determining what's reasonable. So I think that this gives us a steer as to the sorts of things we need to think about when we try to define in a particular set of circumstances what is reasonable. So listen, what I'll do is I'll just run through that, and then perhaps you'll prompt me again, Tina, to come back on the point about teaching assistants and how that works in this context. All right, with that, does that sound okay? So
Perfect.
the first sort of bit of overlap that I indicated, well, I think actually in podcast 1 we looked at a number of ways in which the Children Families Act sort of overlaps with or recognises the Equality Act duties to disabled pupils. And when I mentioned auxiliary aids and services, of course, many of those things would be provided through the SEN framework. So if the child needed a bit of equipment to support their inclusion in school, that may well come as special educational provision in an EHCP or even through SEN support. So the Equality Act recognises that that provision might be made through the SEN framework, and therefore in thinking about what is reasonable, you can take into account what a child may already have through the SEN framework. So, I mean, if the child requires a particular bit of equipment to support their inclusion in the classroom, and that's provided through the SEN framework, the reasonable adjustments duty doesn't require you to provide it again. That would be complete nonsense. It recognises that there may be things that have been made available through the SEN framework, Children and Families Act requirements, and it might, a reasonable adjustment might, for example, be the way that is then used in the classroom, if that's not tightly specified in terms of the EHCP. So it might be further, but related to that special educational provision which was already in place. Then, implicit in some of those questions you had, Tina, about the cost of particular provision. Well, the EHRC is quite clear that cost, of course, can be taken into account, but that's going to be taken into account in the context of the overall resources available to the school. And if we think just in terms of financial resources initially, then obviously, a small school, or even, because this applies to early year settings as well, a small early years setting is not going to be expected to make as costly an adjustment as a very large secondary school or an FE college, for example. So both cost and the resources available to that particular school or setting can be taken into account in determining what is reasonable. But there are some other really sensible considerations as well. So whether something is practicable, is this possible to do this in a manageable way in a classroom or a school, but also how effective an adjustment is going to be. And for that, I do think I just want to refer back to the points I made about including children and young people themselves and thinking about what's going to work for you, what's going to make this okay for you. That's not to say there may not need to be a discussion. It might be that someone comes up with the idea of doing something and the teacher says, but I can't make that work in this classroom. So you need to have that sort of creative discussion then about what would work and what would work for the child in that classroom, but also what would be practicable for the school to implement. Just an aside on that point, where there is a sort of adversarial tone to the discussion between families and schools, there is a risk that you lose that creative element, where schools feel defensive because they think parents are going to be demanding too much, or where parents feel the school is going to deny them what they want. Then that ability to think creatively with each other then seems to fly out of the window. And that, I think, the ability to preserve that creative discussion is really essential to making effective, reasonable adjustments. And I think the problems about that more adversarial approach, where both families and schools may have taken up a particular position, is very difficult once it has got to that point to have that creative discussions, which is why it's so important when a disabled child starts at a school that schools aren't defensive about a disabled pupil joining the school, and that parents aren't withholding information about it because they fear the school is going to send them elsewhere. It's sad that can sour the relationship so early on for a child, but we really need to try and approach this whole area in a way that is open and creative, but honest as well. Parents able to say, I just don't think that would work for my child because, and schools able to say, well, is there another way that we could do this that would be workable for us? Then that conversation tends to evaporate when it's one person saying, my child needs this, the other one saying, we can't provide that. So I think that creative discussion is really, really important to identify both what is effective, which is what the EHR encourages to think about, and what is practicable.
And it's part of that creative discussion. I mean, you mentioned it in the first episode of the reasonable adjustments subject for the podcast, is that, where possible, you should involve the child or young person that is at the centre of this, because in order for it to be creative, I would say that actually the person of which these reasonable adjustments are being made to support should really be part of those conversations, because that's the only way you can get creative anyway.
Yeah, yeah. And I think, it may be that where a child is not able immediately to provide that sort of input, that actually, both parents and teachers need to observe perhaps an adjustment that they've agreed they would try. They could see whether this is being effective and whether it's practicable for the school to implement. But absolutely, the insights of children and young people themselves are really, really important to this. And we tend to be a bit dismissive of children's abilities to articulate their views, whether spoken language or by other means. I'll never forget a visit to an early years setting, a specialist early years setting, where a colleague of mine, on arriving, started to engage with one of the children and was told very firmly, "Oh, you won't be able to learn anything from him because he can't communicate." Well, when she left at the end of that visit, she was in no doubt about that child's views. He was very well able to communicate them, albeit it wasn't through spoken language, but she understood very clearly what his views were. So we shouldn't underestimate children's ability to communicate. And if not in anticipation of the event, then by looking at a child's response to something that we test out. Would this adjustment work? And yes, if it does, a teacher's observation might be this seemed to work, but parents might think, actually, do you know, he was really upset because of what happened. We need to continue to think about it, but we must, if we can't, through our spoken language, have a discussion about what might work for a child, when then we need to be alert to the potential for trying out things and carefully observing whether they're both being effective for the child themselves and practicable for the school to implement.
And that's an important point, isn't it? That just because you set up some reasonable adjustments, say at the beginning of term, and then by, the Christmas holidays, you're going into the spring term, it might be that you might need to adjust some of those reasonable adjustments. Just because they worked in one term, it might not work in another.
Yeah.
And so it is that ongoing conversation, reviewing cycle of, so it's working or no, it's not. So what else do we need to do, isn't it?
Yes, and it's part of a sort of natural process of learning and development for children. Schools provide a changing range of experiences for children to support children's learning and development. And so the environment around children changes as they progress through their school career. So, of course, those adjustments do need to change, and children themselves learn and develop. And something that is resolved at one stage by making a particular reason, but is going to change as the child changes and the school environment changes. Absolutely, yeah. So, keeping it under review is really, really important. There are some other things which the EHRC says we should take into account in thinking about what's reasonable. And they talk about health and safety requirements. My experience is that sometimes schools think they can't do something because of health and safety, but the reasonable adjustments duty doesn't say you don't do it if you can't meet with the health and safety requirements. The reasonable adjustment is to make an adjustment which does support the health and safety requirements. It's not to fly in the face of, and therefore we can't do that. It's to find something that will work both in terms of the effectiveness for the child or young person and the health and safety requirements. So it might be about the storage of a standing frame or something. Well, we have to find the appropriate way of storing so that it doesn't create a health and safety hazard for other school users. So there's that kind of consideration. And there is another consideration, which is the need to maintain standards at the school. That might be academic standards, it might be musical, sporting, or disciplinary standards, or whatever at the school. So again, it's about thinking, what are we going to do by way of an adjustment for this particular child without compromising our overall expectations about standards? So those sorts of things need to be taken into account as well. So I think we talked enough about some of the examples in podcast 1 where actually you might need to make an adjustment for an individual child, but you don't thereby compromise your expectations around behaviour across the school. But you do need to make adjustments that don't that avoid that placing that child or young person at a substantial disadvantage.
So we've talked a lot about schools in the main because that's the main place of where children are. But we have touched on in the first episode of this series around the early years and FE, so further education is slightly different. Did you want to mention about like the third area of adjustment in regards to the school, the early years and the FE?
Well, for early years settings and FE colleges, that second requirement, the middle requirement around alterations to physical features, that does apply to early years settings and to FE colleges. But remember, it's still governed by what is reasonable. And those are those things we've just talked about. So it's cost in relation to overall resources, it's talked about the standards, talked about health and safety requirements, but also crucially, and for me, this is a sort of central one, is the adjustment effective, and is it practicable? And I mean, I just refer to an example of one college which installed some little some learning pods in a reception area, acoustically kind of very efficient, and for young people at college who were easily distracted, who could retreat to these pods and focus on their studies without the distractions around them. So that might be a reasonable adjustment in a large FE college. It probably wouldn't be in an early years setting. So and
yeah, so it is, as you say, it's got to be practicable and it's got to be reasonable. Like you just can't expect a nursery set, for instance, that's only got 20 kids putting in a huge expense for one child that actually might blow their budget for 10 years or something ridiculous. It is about that, isn't it? But again, it's about the conversations, isn't it, around how to meet in the middle. Like if it's a discussion that you're talking about around the accessibility or a child being welcomed into that environment, it's that compromise and that meet in the middle sometimes that is required, isn't it?
And just sticking with the physical environment for a minute, a small early years setting, it might be that the reorganization of the learning space without actually removing any physical features would enable access for a young child who, with the current organisation and layout, as it were, would not be. So, and there are primary schools in one local authority I know where nearly all the primary schools are on a sort of 45-degree slope, if you like, so that they also often reorganize where one level of the school is very accessible. They have then changed around the location of the different year groups in order to accommodate a disabled child and provide access to the appropriate level. So, they've moved around the year groups rather than actually make physical alterations to the school. Longer term, they may well have plans for, perhaps should I talk a little bit about accessibility plans, Tina? And
please. Please do.
And the other, what I call the strategic duties, it requires governors and trustees to think longer term about improving access and equality, because I would put the public sector equality duty into this same area of strategic duties. I'll talk about the accessibility planning duty first, because that links in to the physical features discussion that we've just had. But the accessibility planning duty requires schools to plan to increase access to the physical environment of the school, which you would expect from an accessibility plan, but it also has two other elements there. It is, secondly, to increase access to the curriculum for disabled pupils and to increase access to information for disabled pupils where it's provided in writing to other pupils who are not disabled. So the format in which we provide information for children and disabled children and young people themselves. This is not about information for parents, which I've found many schools think this is about information for parents. And it's actually the written material that we provide for most pupils. So let's sort of go through those in order. So the physical environment. So the accessibility planning duty is about increasing access to the physical environment of the school. And it is about access to all the facilities of the school. So yes, it's about sort of classic ramps and doorways kind of thing, actually physically getting in and out of the school. It's about moving around the school, but it's also access to, for example, recreational areas. So for children who might be overwhelmed by a busy, noisy, active playground environment, maybe providing part of the playground, which is a quiet area where they can then join the recreational time, but without the overload of the noise and activity that's going on in other parts of the playground. So it might be ensuring they have access to those recreational opportunities. Then the second one is about access to the curriculum, increasing access to the curriculum for disabled pupils. Remember, this is a longer term planning duty. So perhaps being aware that maths is less accessible, or perhaps disabled children are not accessing maths. It could be any subject. I just happen to notice maths on a prompt just beside me here. So you might actually have a program of considering how to improve access to maths for disabled pupils. The one I almost referred to this before is sometimes it's thought that additional TA support in a subject will help, but sometimes as a parent and a young person I met in a school, it was actually about his needing more help from a specialist maths teacher who really understood where he was in his learning and development, and getting that help and support applied, or possibly more detailed analysis of the curriculum to enable other maths teachers to understand where disabled pupils were in their learning and development, and adjust the provision in the classroom to suit this. So that might be a matter of a planned activity over a longer period of time. An accessibility plan runs for 3 years and must be reviewed and revised in between time as well. So an accessibility plan addresses the first two items that I've talked about, the access to the physical environment, increasing access to the curriculum, and thirdly, increasing access to information for disabled pupils. Now, that might be about the choice of textbooks that a school uses. It might be about providing some information in easy read for pupils with a learning difficulty. It might be about enlarging a worksheet for a pupil with a vision impairment. So it's a whole range of ways in which we provide information for disabled pupils. It might be about sending a text home with some information because a pupil is not able to access the information in I don't know, at the end of a lesson where some information is given out to other pupils. So there's a whole range of ways in which that might be planned for. But importantly, this needs to come from an understanding of where disabled pupils' access to the life of the school is compromised, but could be amended, increased by some longer term planning. And there should be it's the responsibility of the governors or the trustees to ensure this accessibility plan is in place. And that sits alongside the public sector equality duty, which requires schools to have regard to the need to reduce or eliminate discrimination, to improve equality of opportunity, and to foster good relations between pupils who share a particular protected characteristic and those who don't. So because we're focuses on disabilities as disabled children and other children who are not disabled. So importantly, when we're doing any of what we've talked about, we need to have an eye on whether it is promoting those good relations between disabled pupils and pupils who are not disabled. So it's about making sure we take our non-disabled population with us, even though alongside the reasonable adjustments duty, there is a duty which may sometimes require us to treat disabled pupils more favourably. Well, that might be seen to be undermining good relations between disabled pupils and pupils who are not disabled. But in practice, that because there's this broader consideration, is one of the 3 elements in the public sector equality duty that schools must have regard to, and they must be able to show that they've had regard. So, for example, minutes of governing body meetings or academy trustee meetings should show how schools and academies have arrived at a particular decision. And the public sector equality duty requires schools to gather information annually about equality considerations. So how well are disabled pupils performing? How well are they progressing? How do they show up in any of the data about incidents of behaviour or exclusions or suspensions, or their participation in after-school activities. There's a whole range of ways that might highlight whether disabled pupils are participating in the whole life of the school along with their non-disabled peers. So that information needs to be gathered once a year, and at least every 4 years, so not more than 4 years, schools must set objectives, equality objectives, to show how they are going to address any of those shortfalls or challenges they've identified through the information that they've collected. So those two strategic duties together create a really important longer term perspective for schools to plan to improve access and inclusion and equalities considerations over time. So my point is the reasonable adjustments duty requires that immediate and that thinking ahead, but actually these longer term duties that sit around that reasonable adjustments duty can help schools to, if you like, reduce or minimize the extent to which they need to make those individual adjustments by making adjustments to the organisation of the curriculum or the deployment of specialist teachers, or increasing children's participation in after-school activities, things where we know disabled children are at a disadvantage. And that this is an opportunity to take a longer-term, more strategic view. So parents might want to look at their child's school's website and see if the accessibility plan is up there and see what the equality objectives address. And if they're asked for a view to contribute to the development of the next round of information or to contribute views for the next accessibility plan, that's an opportunity to raise issues about those sort of longer term planning issues that may make a real difference to the way in which their child can participate in the whole life of the school.
I think that is the perfect end of this discussion and perfectly timed as well, Philippa. I think that, you know, it just boils down to involvement, isn't it, for children, young people and their families that may have a disability, to have that conversation around, you know, whether they fit the criteria, whether, you know, some of the reasonable adjustments are reasonable or not. But that conversation has to start, that communication has to start this whole process. And, you know, where somebody is in disagreement around what is reasonable and what isn't, again, it's that asking the child and young person, having that discussion and having that compromise of, so what can be achieved, what is reasonable, how reasonable it is, and if not, and if you know, parents feel, or children, young people feel that they've asked for reasonable adjustments and they have been reasonable and nothing has happened and they've been discriminated against, it is that conversation then of going to CENDIAS, as you say, and having a conversation with them to look at whether or not there's been some discrimination, and then take it to a tribunal if they feel, and as you say, that, you know, parents really do that as a last ditch attempt,
Yeah.
isn't it?
Mm. And it may be that CENDIAS would enable parents and the school to have a conversation. Quite often the presence of a third party in that discussion changes the dynamics in a way that's helpful and may be able to help you know, support a conversation about what would be reasonable for the school to do.
And
but
it's
where
worth,
relation Oh, excuse me,
Bless
sorry.
you. No, bless you.
Where
And
relationships have broken down, you know,
yeah,
sending out is probably the best place. But if sending out can still support a conversation between the parents and the school, that's unquestionably it's so much better than going to the
yeah. And I
tribunal.
was,
Yeah,
and I was going to say as well, you know, Sendias can go with you and accompany you to these meetings with schools. You know,
yeah.
that's part of their offer. That you might have to wait for it, but it is part of their offer. Um, Thank you, Philippa, again for agreeing to do this podcast. I will say again, we will put the links to those booklets with CDC, so the Council for Disabled Children's website. They are essential to read because this podcast, the 2 episodes that we've done on reasonable adjustments, has been quite meaty, and you may need well, I'm sure that you will need to read the guides that go along with that just to secure your knowledge, because it is a lot, isn't it, for people to understand.
And I probably rather gabbled through it as well, Tina, if I'm
No,
honest. I
you did
probably
not. You did not at all. You did not. So thank you again, and please do take that. Have a look at the guidance that we're going to post on our links with YouTube and on our social media as well.
Thanks, Tina, and thanks so much for inviting me. It's a real privilege to be able to talk about the duties and I hope provide a little bit of help in understanding how the duties work.
And we're privileged to have your company, so thank you.